Hello everyone, welcome to this session, Mental Ill Health today. Can-do conversations. I hope you like that little tagline there. We're going to run a few of these can-do conversations, and as I mentioned in my email when I talked to you about it, the idea is that I need to be bringing in people who've got different skill sets other than mine, and although I'm quite happy to chat to you for days on end about my opinion, it's much better when you've got people who are experts in their field. So I'll talk to you a bit more about can-do conversations in a minute. First of all, just to let you know, what we've got going on today is we have Sarah Townsend here. She's going to give an overview of mental health and how it looks in your classrooms and some statistics for you to think about. Sarah runs a company called Disability Learning. She works with learning disabilities, profound and multiple learning disabilities, moderate learning disabilities, and all kinds of different areas such as autism, etc. A very interesting person to talk to. So mental health is part of the work that she does. In terms of this webinar, just to let you know that if you have any technical problems, it's more than likely going to be at your end, because sometimes if you're accessing tech from a college or something like that, you are up against, if you like, some of their very vicious virus checkers and stuff like that. But if you have problems, just log back in again and try to pick up where we were before, because you'll be able to pick up and join in again if you just go back through the link. If it all goes really wrong, don't worry, because we're recording this and it means that you can get a look at it a bit later, and I'll get in touch with you about that. There is some time for questions at the end, so if as we go along through you've got some questions, then please use the screen that you have. There's a section there for questions. You need to type them in. I will read them and Sarah will do her best to answer them. If we don't get a chance to answer them all today, they do print out on our report, so we'll try and get the questions answered back to you when we've read the report at the end, all right? So there'll be some feedback as well. So all I really need to do now then is to hand you over to Sarah. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a bit scary. It's my first time, but I'll go with it. So today we're talking about mental ill health. I like to use the term mental ill health because sometimes when we talk about mental health, we look at the negative side, we talk about the difficulties and the problems that someone was having. But actually mental health is something that we all have. It's part of our well-being. It's the same sort of thing as physical health. It's as important as physical health. And so I like to emphasise that we're talking about someone that has mental ill health. And it's on a continuum. Sorry. So when we look at mental ill health, it's on a continuum, and we all sometimes have times when we feel a little anxious, or especially if Ofsted are just about to come in, we might go down the continuum to becoming mentally unwell sometimes, or if we just got a grade 1, we might be up at the top of the continuum where we're mentally well. But for some people, they stay further down on the continuum of being mentally unwell. So it's really important that we focus on and understand what causes mental ill health. So we're going to just look at a few things that cause mental ill health, and then maybe talk about the impact in the classroom and just a few strategies that you may be able to use when you're working with students. So first of all, what is mental ill health? Basically, it's something that affects our thinking, feeling and behaviour. It has to be significant though. We all have feelings, think and behaviour, but it has to have a significant impact on us. So it might cause us distress, or it might actually cause other people distress. The problem with mental health is it's so diverse. It's got a big spectrum, and it ranges from lots of different things. So each individual person is unique, and their needs are unique, and that's why it's sometimes hard to find the best support strategies for them. I love this slide, because often when I do training, people come up to me and say, talk about their own experience of mental illness, and say that people don't understand and tell them to snap out of it. And really, we've got to think about mental illness as the same as physical physical illness, and treat it the same. Someone can't just snap out of it. They can't just make themselves better or just put up with it. It's not something that's going to happen. And it's like telling a deaf person to listen harder. It's not going to happen. So what we need to do is think about the discrimination that goes on. 87% of people with mental health problems feel that they have been discriminated against when they declare that they have mental ill health. And this makes it much harder for us when for students to disclose information if they feel they're going to be stigmatised because of their previous problems. Sometimes they just want a clean slate. They don't want anyone to know that they've had difficulties, and they might actually be well at the time, so they don't want that baggage coming along with them. I think what's really important is that we think about mental ill health in the same way as we think about physical ill health, and until we get those two illnesses, those two things actually together equally, people with mental ill health will still feel stigmatised. In fact, the government recently said they're going to put a lot of money into services for people with mental ill health, but it's still the Cinderella service. There's still a lot that needs to happen for people to get the right support. So, just some facts. And it's quite interesting when we look at facts that 50% of mental health conditions begin before the age of 14. When you think of the students that you're working with, some of you might be working in schools and some of you might be working in colleges, you're probably working with the prime people that show that the condition is beginning to show. So this might manifest through anxiety, panic attacks. Behaviour can often be a sign of that there's a problem, or someone being absent from school or college. And unless we put the intervention in very early, those problems get larger and more difficult to deal with. So, and interestingly, the condition will be developed by the age of 24. So that means by the age of 24, a person will have had their condition for a while. Maybe it hasn't been spotted, and maybe they haven't had the treatment that they've needed. The problem you have with working with teenagers is that sometimes their signs and symptoms are masked by typical adolescent behaviour. When you think of teenagers, they can be stroppy, they can come to college late, they can miss school because they can't be bothered, and sometimes that masks the symptoms of mental ill health, so that it can be challenging to spot those conditions in people at that young age. The other thing that sometimes there is perception, I suppose, is that once you have mental health problems, you have them for life, but that's not true. Often people with mental health problems, after 18 months of having a mental health condition, they are completely fine and they don't ever have it again. So it's quite important to remember that. I think also that the problem about treatment is that unless we treat people, those people moving into adulthood, they just carry on. So I can give you an example of someone that I know that has got an eating disorder. It wasn't picked up, although the signs were showing at the age of 14, her BMI was at a very low stage, but not at a marker that the GPs recognise. So I think it was a point under what they would start investigating. But what they didn't look at was how drastic her weight loss had become. Within 3 months she'd lost 2 stone, which was clearly evident that there was some sort of difficulty. But none of that was picked up, despite her going to the doctor and saying, I might have a problem. Because she was still in the average markers, they felt that there was no problem. And that eventually manifested into a full-blown eating disorder that probably, if picked up at an early stage, she would have got the support she needed, and maybe, you know, the early intervention would have prevented her from having the problems she had later on in life. So it's vital that we do engage early to improve those outcomes and recovery. We're just going to quickly look at the different types of mental ill health, because there are some common things. Mixed anxiety and depression is the most common disorder in Britain. So we're going to look a little bit more later on about how we work with anxiety and moods. But when we look at mood disorders, we're talking about some people with mood disorders, with bipolar, there's phobias, post-traumatic stress syndrome, those types of things that affect your mood. So we would say that people with depression that's the most common cause of mental illness in Britain, and that's what we need to support. So we've got mood disorders, and we would say 1 in 20 people have are diagnosed with clinical depression in the country. And also, to be able to be diagnosed, you have to have a medical examination. We're moving on to psychosis. When we look at psychosis, we're looking at schizophrenia, drug-induced psychosis. I don't know if any of you are fans of EastEnders, but recently they've had post-depression but psychosis. So Stacey with her baby, and they had a whole episode of how she had psychosis. And what we're saying here is when things aren't real. They're real to them, they might hallucinate and that sort of thing, but they are much more than postnatal depression. And then we're looking at the neuropsychiatric and development disorders. So these are things like Tourette's syndrome, autism, although it is not defined as a mental illness in itself, it actually causes mental illness. Again, with ADHD, that's a similar thing. Although it's not classified as mental illness, it actually has people that have ADHD may have mental illness as well. So Asperger's, all of those types of things are part of that neuropsychiatric and the development disorders. We then look at the eating disorders, and I think, as you see, I don't know, I know a lot about eating disorders. They are on the rise, definitely on the rise. Although it says girls have a higher rate of eating disorders than boys, that's actually not the case. Often it is that boys don't often declare or talk about their eating disorders, so it's not quite the same. And then we're looking at personality disorders. When we look at personality disorders, it's like the paranoid, antisocial and borderline personality disorders, but they are much harder to diagnose. Finally, which isn't on that slide, is dual diagnosis. So dual diagnosis can be coexist with drug and alcohol addiction, as well as learning disability. I think sometimes that is often left out, that people with learning disabilities have a higher rate of mental illness as well, and that's sometimes forgotten about.
Can I ask you some questions, Sarah, before we get back into open questions to the others? I go back to this one particularly. The age, 50% of mental health conditions begin by age 14. So if you're working in a secondary school or in college, then you've got 50%. That's not quite right, is it? It's people who have mental health conditions.
Yes, 50%
are in that age range.
Yeah, that's when they start to manifest, really.
So how would we know what to look for in class?
As I said, it's difficult because of the teenage behaviour, but it's looking at patterns. So if a person is behaving differently, if a person is starting to do things that they wouldn't do already, or showing signs of anxiety. As I said to you earlier, we will talk about anxiety because that's often the first sign that someone starts to become anxious. So they might start to become anxious, and then because of that they start staying away from school.
Staying away, right, so absences would be one
It
sign.
is an indicator, definitely.
Unusual absences.
Yes, so I mean, if there's someone student that's always been absent all the time, so it's looking at patterns to see how that has changed, and patterns of behaviour. If someone has all, for example, been quite extrovert and joins in class conversations, but all of a sudden they start to withdraw and be isolated, that could be a sign. And vice versa, if someone is isolated but all of a sudden becomes quite I suppose not risky behaviour, what I'm trying to say is they would talk a lot, take over, be quite pushy. That could also be erratic, that's what I was trying to say.
Right, so where it hasn't actually been a personality,
yes,
part of their characteristic before. So if that suddenly was present, you're
yeah,
saying that would be a sign. So you've got a thing, haven't you, the cycle
yes,
of anxiety.
yeah. So when we
that,
look at a cycle of anxiety, it's really important to look at the way to help someone is to look at the cycle first, to get them to identify what the anxiety is, and that can be quite difficult. Obviously, with the cycle anxiety, there's always going to be a trigger, some sort of trigger. Now, some people won't always recognise the trigger, but it's trying to find out what that trigger might be. Once there's the trigger, and then there's a thought of panic. So the thoughts of panic go through your brain, which react and cause emotion. Those emotions then cause a physical reaction and a behavioural reaction. So someone might become very panicky and run out of the room, for example. Someone might withdraw completely, or just be overloaded and start to. I've had it before where someone hid under the table because they just wanted to shut themselves out, really. So when working with students on coping strategies, I suppose, it's about identifying what their anxiety might be. And one of the tricks really is to try and get them to think about their thoughts. Their thoughts aren't actually facts. If we're scared of a spider, we've got to look at why we're scared of that spider. The thought is that the spider might hurt us. Well, that's not fact. Often we don't live in Australia. A spider's not going to hurt us. So you've got to get them to think their thoughts aren't facts, and then recognise what they're thinking. Once they've recognised, okay, I'm scared of that spider and it really makes me feel ill, but that is not going to hurt me, they recognise that thought, and then they've got to try and question the thoughts that they had. So yes, as I said about the spider not hurting me, and then try and adapt it. So if we think about something for, I don't know, maths, I know some people, for example, someone I work with Tourette's, who used to get really anxious about going into a maths class, and this was because the thought of doing maths was just beyond them.
We can all identify with that thought, can't we?
Yeah, they thought that they just couldn't do it. And partly their experience of maths in the past have been they were given things that they couldn't understand, and it just caused them anxiety. So, and it made their tics and stuff much worse because they had Tourette's. So one of the things there was to get them to think about what it is that causes that anxiety. Okay, so we get them to look at that and then look at how we might adapt that. What we did in the classroom was look at how we boosted their self-confidence and gave them something that we knew that they could do to begin with, so that they didn't feel so anxious and that they could move on to develop, to try and tackle more difficult things when they had that self-confidence. In that sense, it adapted their behaviour because they started to question, well, actually, maths isn't that scary. Why am I scared of maths? Maths isn't causing me that much anxiety. And if I do have a problem with the adaptive behaviour, I know that I can go and get some support for it. So that was the strategy that worked really well for.
What about if you've got a student who is showing the absences, and what I've understood is that the anxiety around coming back to college or back to school after an absence can be so severe that you end up dropping out because you've missed so much. There's a bit of stigma attached to your absence. You're worried about being told off.
Yeah.
You're behind with your work. You've lost out on your friendship groups, or you're not part of, the in crowd. What do you do about that?
I think the thing that's really important is keeping in touch. Often people are quite anxious and it builds up. Now, as you said, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the thing is doesn't always mean the student's going to respond, but about keeping in touch so they feel that they know what's going on, so that when they come back to the lesson, school, they are aware of things and they don't feel so isolated. So things like sending text messages, emails, little notes. I wouldn't recommend phoning straight away because it depends on your relationship with the student. Sometimes I know from people I've worked with that phone calls are quite difficult and they often don't pick them up, they just ignore them. Whereas if you send something through social media or a text, it's physical, they can look at it when they feel able to and they can respond if they want to, but also it's about keeping them in touch and so they feel able to come back.
So would you send some work home then, maybe with some instructions on what they need to do to keep on top of
Yeah, I think it depends on, and it's a conversation with parents and other people, but that is a good thing to do if it's at the stage where a person, I mean, if you're looking at someone with bipolar and they've got extreme mood swings and they're really, really, really down, it might not be appropriate because that might just send them over the edge. But if it's someone that is that you know of that just needs that extra encouragement and support, by sending work home that they can do in their own time, it helps them to relieve that pressure so that when they come back they know they're not too far behind.
So maybe offer it, and then if you don't know for sure, then just offer them up. And that extra 5 or 10 minutes that it might take you as a member of staff to deal with that might be a really good, save that student. They understand that there's some link there that they can.
And it pulls them back. It stops you losing touch altogether. And I think that's the worst thing with mental ill health. Often people feel isolated. They don't feel able to maybe tell you how they're feeling. And often I know with friends that that have mental breakdowns, and they haven't. When you text them and things like that, they haven't responded. But afterwards, they've said that is the thing that kept them going. That's the thing that kept them going because they knew that people were still thinking about them, and that gave them the ability to sort of step back into the cycle, if you like.
The danger is that we feel more competent to deal with mental ill health in our students than we actually are. It's always really about saying, well, I'll do what I can, I'll recognise the signs, but I do need to pass this person on to someone who can give them much more the correct kind of support.
And that's the challenge we have. As I said, the government are pledging all this money to boost up services, but at the moment there isn't very much out there that you can offer students. So CAMS is obviously children and adolescents mental health services is obviously the route to go for many students, but they sometimes have big waiting lists. And when we go back to the person I talked about with an eating disorder, they won't support them until they've got the problem. And sometimes it's trying to, if you get it before it becomes a full problem, then it's going to go away much easier. So that's the challenge we all have. And until we recognise, and until the government put as much money into the mental health services as they do the physical illness health services, where it's always going to be the Cinderella service.
And unfortunately, but it's invisible. So we don't always know about
other things when you're working with students. It's really important to make the environment comfortable and allow them time out, because time out's really important, especially if someone's becoming a bit stressed or panicky. Some good tips here, like grounding. When someone's really got a panic attack or a really high anxiety, grounding. So they might be at the classroom, they might be having some sort of difficulty in the toilet or something, or in the corridor. It's getting a student to speak to the student, get them to tell you 5 things that they can see, 4 things that they can hear, 3 things that they can touch, 2 things that they can smell, and 1 thing that they can taste. This sort of takes away from the anxiety and the problem that's going on and actually grounds them back into that, like our primate. Yes, that's right. Okay. And it focuses back on that instead of the problem. So that sometimes is a strategy that you can try and use that helps sometimes. The problem is that all these strategies might help sometimes, and because, as I said at the beginning, mental illness is so unique and diverse that it's different, and your relationship with the student is different as well. So it depends on what all of those sorts of things. You just got to trial and error.
Thank you, Sarah. That's really, really useful. Look, a couple of things just to go on to. If you want to know more about this, I mean, this is a snapshot, and I think you'll realise that it's such an interesting but vast subject. Sarah does an in-house session, which obviously it would be within a group of people, and there's lots of tasks that you can get involved with. And here's the outline of that half-day session. It can be 2.5 or 3 hours. Increase awareness, and there'll be much more of the types of mental health problems that you might encounter. Look at the barriers. So what is the barrier to learning that this condition brings to your class, and then strategies to overcome them, and look at managing some challenging situations. And if you're like me, you'll have been in classes where you've seen behaviour and you're not sure where it's come from, but there's some things you can do that would help no matter what the cause of the behaviour, because some things, they are mandatory in terms of your first step towards managing it. But I don't know if I've told you before, I probably have, because I do bang on about things, but we've recently written this Level 2 award, which is skills for learning support practitioners, which we're turning into home study, distance learning, and in it is a mental health module. So these are the outcomes, the learning outcomes for the mental health module. And you can see that it breaks it down into basically 6 questions. So that 2 learning outcomes: understand the impact, and then understand the barriers to learning and strategies to reduce it. So if you're looking to upskill because this is an area that you're particularly interested in, then this is one of the modules for that Level 2 award. Here are all the others. The way it works is you have to do the mandatory unit, which is this one, the role of a learning support practitioner, and then you choose 2 of the others, and supporting learners with mental ill health is one of them. So you can choose 2 of any of the others for the Level 2 award. For the extended award, you have to have 5 more, and for there's a certificate which is 8 more. But anyway, the point is that you can actually find out much more about supporting learners with mental ill health within this Level 2 award, okay, and it's home study. So if you want to know more about that, then please do get in touch and we can let you know more about how to access it as a home study option. You can have it in-house. If you want to talk to us about that, then please do. What we're going to do now is look at some questions. This part for me can become quite complicated because I've got to try and click on things and see who's asked me some questions. So at the moment there aren't any questions here on the list, but we have had one that's been sent in. So what I want to do is ask Sarah that question. So here it is. Somebody has emailed to say, right, in your opinion, when dealing with students from our independent living department who mainly all have a learning difficulty or disability, what are the best resources to use for self-harm? Okay, so I'm sure that there'll be a few who might be familiar with that. Resources to use for self-harm to assist with keeping cuts clean and working through their issues. Now, we're not suggesting for a moment that any of you try to manage self-harm, but this question is about what you give to your student to help them to manage it. So this question is from Dawn. She's asked for lots of picture-based resources with some useful information to guide them. So what do you think, Sarah?
This is a tricky one because obviously you need lots of pictorial information, and there is one website that Hillary's going to show you now. I think it's on. Is it on the next slide? Easyhealth.org.uk that do a lot of information. Basically they do it easy read, so they have got a leaflet on self-harm there, which is all pictorial. It might not give all the information that person wants to know, because theirs is particularly about keeping cuts clean and dry, is it? But they might have another a leaflet on there about keeping cuts dry, not necessarily clean and hygienic, not necessarily about self-harm, but that particular leaflet is about self-harm and the different types of self-harm and what you can do about it and how you should do it. It's quite a useful leaflet for people who find English hard to read, because it's lots of pictorial, so it doesn't have to just be for people with learning disabilities. It could be.
Got audio on that website as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, so that's one resource, but there isn't that many out there for people with learning disabilities, because it has to be pictorial. Often people make them themselves. There is a forum you can go on and ask people, which I will do, to see if there is any more, but they're often health professionals, so there'd be learning disability nurses that would develop those types of leaflets.
Okay, I've got another question here, thankfully. How do you involve parents if you are concerned about a student's mental ill health?
Right, tricky. It's tricky, and it depends on the age of the student. It is important to involve parents, so it might be just voicing your concerns to begin with. Sometimes parents don't always want to recognise that their son or daughter has a mental illness, or that their parent might also have a mental illness, so that can be a double whammy, if you like. But it is about gently maybe starting, you know, what your concerns are, and how looking at really saying the reason we're having this conversation is because we want the best support for your son or daughter, and this is how we're going to do it. What do we need to do to support them? We want to know what you feel. I think that's the angle it's got to come from, not necessarily what the illness you think, because it's hard because they might not even have a diagnosis if they're in school. So it's just going to be about their learning and what the difficulties they are having.
It's the barriers, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what you're all after is the successful outcome for the young person. But there's always this problem, isn't there, about, oh, I don't give you permission to phone my parents, and with the,
yes, it is
age groups,
yeah.
And sometimes you can fall foul of that when actually all you're doing is trying to find the best strategies to help the young person. So it's a very fine line.
I think it is, and it's about knowing that student, isn't it, and the family get up, if you like, so that you know whether that might cause more anxiety or not, because sometimes the stress is from the family, and so by contacting them it can make it worse. So there is you're right, Hilary, there is a fine balance that sometimes until you're in that situation you're not going to know.
When it comes to self-harm, I recall a few years ago that we had a student who would harm, but also it was, you know, I hate to say attention seeking because obviously there's a reason for everything, but this particular student would display the blood and the, you know, and it was actually very weird self-harm as well. And so we had to do a risk assessment with this student, and the saddest thing of all was that we had to ask the student to stay away while the wound was open, while it was still fresh and, you know, easily visible because of the way it was being displayed. So that had a double-edged thing, because then we were preventing her from coming to college.
And she was missing
part of her work, and so. But it was so essential because we had to think of the bigger picture. And yes, we kept in touch with her at home and things like that. But is that what you would say was a good approach if somebody was being quite dramatic about their self-harm?
I think so, because you don't want to reward that sort of behaviour. So, but you also don't want to punish it. But by keeping them away, at least then till it's healed, because obviously it can then be infected. There's all sorts of other issues that are involved. That when the student comes back, then you can start focusing just on the work, because that's what educators are there for, aren't they? We're there to focus on the education. And yes, things like this get in the way. Self-harm is increasingly becoming a problem in schools and colleges. More and more people are doing it, and in fact there's statistics that show the increase is so high in A&E and things like that, and it is a cry for help. And even though people are now being more okay with it, showing not covering up so much, and sort of I suppose, you know, showing people as a trophy, if you like, it still is a cry for help.
Yes,
it still is a cry for help.
Well,
so we need to support them.
It's interesting, isn't it? That's all we've got time for, actually, because we're going to get booted off if we're not careful. Let me just finish off by saying thank you very much, Sarah, for coming along today and chatting with me about this. As I said, we've only scratched the surface, I believe.
Completely, there's massive to talk about.
But there's some things we don't want to all be experts, but we do. I think it's important that we all know what we're seeing.
I think that's the important thing in raising awareness. The more we talk about mental ill health, the more people are going to be accepting of it, and it will become more of a,
and not just deal with the behaviour, but deal with the reason for it, or manage it better. So, more can-do conversations coming soon. I've managed to secure the services for Ian Smith, and he is, I think he's called a coach, but he talks about time management. He does all sorts of things in terms of managing yourself, and in these days of cuts of staff and money in our area of education, I think he'll have some really good tips for you if you wanted to try and find ways to streamline your operation, and that's going to be on the 9th of May at 4 o'clock. Now, once again, I will send out a link if you want to register for it, and if you can't make that day and time, then obviously you'll be able to get a recording. I've also been speaking to Steve Russell. He deals with emotional resilience, and he works with teachers all over the country, We haven't nailed a date down yet, but that's going to be something I think will be very interesting to explore with him, not just for ourselves but also for our students. You know, it's a technique. I think he'll share some ideas. And then Sarah's agreed to come back and speak to us about deaf and deaf. And you may not realise that deaf with a capital D means something different than deaf with a small d.
It sure does.
So if you work with students with a whole range of disabilities, and perhaps you come in contact with students who've got hearing impairments of some description, then that'll be good for you. So we'll nail a date down for that also, and I'll let you know when it's going to be. So that's it. If you want to know more about anything, you want to ask any more questions, if you want to book Sarah to come and talk to your teams, just give us a call or an email. Look, I'm in one there, you know it, info@can-do-behaviour.co.uk, and Sarah is sarah@disabilitylearning.co.uk. So that's all for today. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and see you again very soon. Bye for now.
Bye.